I have a couple teachers from Tunisia.
At Zaytuna? At Zaytuna
No,
College?
no, in the past.
In the past, I know. I
Yeah,
know.
Sheikh
From
and Sheikh Uthman al-Hawamidi.
MashaAllah.
And I also knew Bint Chalabi. Yeah, I met her dad too.
Nice.
In the 80s.
Nice. I think you spent years and years in North Africa, Tunisia,
I was in North
Morocco,
Africa for a while.
Mauritania in particular.
Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria. I visited Tunisia and Libya, and then I was in the Emirates, and I was in Medina, and lived both in Mecca and Medina, studying with some scholars there.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent.
Tunis al-Khadara.
MashaAllah.
So you're the original Africans, because Afriqiya originally was just Tunis.
True. Afriqiya was Tunis, was Tunisia.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we gave the name to the whole continent.
Yeah.
But even now in Tunisia, the idea of identity is subject to heated debate.
Yes.
Some argue that we are Africans and more Africans. Some argue that we are more Arabs, and some others they will argue that Mediterraneans.
I think the DNA is pretty much confirmed that you're more African.
True.
Because the Persians are more Arab than most of the North Africans.
That's true.
The National Geographic did a study, and I think Persians on average had about almost 50% Arab blood. Whereas in places like Tunisia, it was very low. It was a lot of Berber. Libya, I think it was like 17%, and so I mean, everybody mixed, and this idea of purity is a total illusion.
True.
Yeah, I mean, even if you went into deep Arabia today, I think you probably could find some pretty just Arab, but the Arabs are mixed with African, with Indian. The Yemenis have a lot of mixture with Indian.
Yeah.
So this is the world.
But some people are fanatic about their identity, and they have exaggerated pride, which should not be the case, because, as you said, there is no pure race.
Well, also pride should be in your own accomplishments.
True.
I mean, to be proud about what your تلك أمة قد خلت لها ما كسبت ولكم ما كسبتم. يعني Allah's ولا تسألون عما كانوا يعملون. Allah does whatever He. I mean, people are judged by their actions, But whereas we take this false pride in things.
Yeah.
I always marvel, like, people when they compliment you on clothes. Oh, that's a really nice sadriya you have on, and then I always feel like I should thank the tailor. Like, why should I say?
Yes.
Like, I didn't have anything to do with it.
The credit has to go to the tailor. Yes, you're right, for his accomplishment.
So we take credit for a lot of things we have nothing to do with.
True. Excellent. So thank you very much for this very nice chat. This is informal, and perhaps this is the aim of this encounter. It's to engage in an informal discussion on areas related to translation, language, and here in this meeting, of course, to Islamic discourse. So how about if we start the meeting now? I don't like to start it very officially, but just for the recording, we are going to start from where we should start. And I still see some people in the waiting room coming. And it is sometimes very difficult to strike a balance between facilitating in the traditional sense and dealing with technology on the other, accepting and having an eye here and an eye over there. Excellent. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Good evening and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear colleagues, dear scholars. My name is Hammouda Salhi, and I am the director of the master's program in translation and interpreting at the University of Tunis, Manar. Today, we are very delighted to be able to host another online keynote lecture, a lecture that is falling under a series of talks and other online events entitled Encounters at the Shores of Translation, أو حديث على ضفاف الترجمة. Encounter translated here as hadith because the encounter is liqa, but the liqa or the encounter should have the element of hadith. Well, hadith and hadith in Arabic and especially in Islamic tradition has so many meanings, like the hadith, which is a whole discipline. And some of the texts are part of the hadith. So in this series of talks and online events, we have invited a large number of prominent scholars and practitioners in translation and interpreting who have accepted our invitation, and they are being invited to speak about language, about translation, about culture, about interpreting and interpretation. Interpreting as the act of interpreting an interpreter, and interpretation in the sense of a ta'wil. So each one is speaking from his or her own background, his or her own perspective of translation. And I always portray translation as a temple or a mosque with various gates and doors. And these doors, they do welcome people with different backgrounds, different perspectives. So it is my singular honor and great privilege today to introduce you to this evening's guest speaker, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf. You know him all, I assume. He is a prominent and distinguished scholar of Islam. Shaykh Hamza Yusuf is an American convert to Islam, and his full name is Hamza Yusuf Hanson. He currently serves as president of Zaytuna College in Berkeley, California. Perhaps it was named in honor of the great Al-Zaytuna Mosque or Al-Zaytuna University in Tunis, not far away from where I'm sitting now. Zaytuna College was the first accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States, which with both bachelor's and master's degree programs. He was ranked by the Muslim 500 as the 23rd most influential Muslim worldwide, a leading proponent of classical learning, the traditional liberal arts and great books education in both the Western and Muslim traditions. He has translated, authored, and co-authored numerous publications, including scholarly books and articles, as well as papers on major current areas of ethical concern. He serves as vice president of the UAE-based Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies. He is co-president of Religions for Peace and served on the Ethics in Action for Sustainable and Integral Development Initiative. which is a collaboration between religious for peace, the Vatican, the United Nations, and other organizations. He is a member of the Jordanian Royal Academy for Islamic Studies and has worked with Prince Ghazi bin Muhammad on key initiatives promoting peace between Muslims and Christians. He works closely with Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah, the architect of the Marrakesh Declaration, a groundbreaking document in defense of the rights of non-Muslims in Muslim majority societies or communities, translating it into English and promoting it globally. He holds traditional advanced degrees, ijazaat, in Islamic law and theology, as well as a BA in religious studies, San Jose State University, and a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, graduate Theological Union. Personally speaking, I have been following the works, talks, and even the Friday sermons of Shaykh Hamza Yusuf for a long time now, together with my mother, and sometimes I translate some of his talks and sermons into Arabic, Tunisian Arabic, to my mother, and my mother is fascinated with his genius. I have also become fascinated by the encyclopedic knowledge and his promotion of an authentically moderate and contemporary discourse of Islam. And when I started looking for speakers and scholars from translation-related disciplines, my thoughts went immediately to theology and Shaykh Hamza Yusuf in particular. Why? Because I have a firm belief that Shaykh Hamza would give an exceptional lecture on any subject he is invited to speak on, including translation. So I invited him, and I was extremely delighted when he accepted my invitation to speak to my students and colleagues on translation and interpreting or interpretation. Shaykh Hamza will be speaking now about how to best interpret the discourse of Islam or Islam-related texts and discourses to non-Arabs. So, Sheikh, this is the format, perhaps, or the structure of this encounter. Shaykh Hamza will first take the floor to make some opening remarks, in which perhaps he will be framing the discussion. He will be taking some 10 or 15 minutes. Then I will be very glad to host a question and answer session. But I have to say, or I should say that, I should mention that Shaykh Hamza has kindly agreed to extend the time of this session because I can see that the participants who are invited and are in the room are numerous, and I can expect that the discussion will be very rich with that number. So it will be taking time as much as we agree, both or the three of us in a way. So I will hand it over to you, Shaykh Hamza. Thank you again for accepting our invitation, and I am really humbled and touched by your modesty. You have the floor, Shaykh.
Oh, thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. I want to, first of all, thank you for thinking of me and inviting me. Tunis is a country that I grew to love early from first traveling and being some of the scholars that I met, and generally just the people. I was always struck by the the flowers that the people would walk around. I saw it as a place, there's a kind of gentleness in the soul of the Tunisians that I think comes from their deeply dyed spirituality. So In terms of what we're talking about, first of all, I want to really express my admiration. This first time I'm meeting Dr. Hadir, but I just want to express my admiration for your own ability with the English language. It's like all languages, mastery is very difficult, and I'm just very impressed with your introductory remarks and the eloquence with which they were expressed. So,
thank you very much.
In terms of translation, I've done a lot of translating. I don't consider myself a master translator. It's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, to translate, because you're attempting to take the ideas or the concepts or the expressions of someone or something from one language to another language. Now, sometimes that process is actually relatively easy. For instance, if you go from French to Spanish, or Spanish to French, or Italian to Spanish, because these are languages that share really the same source. They're all Latin slang. And because of that, it's much easier to translate. When you take a language, if you go from French to English, it gets a little bit harder, but there's many shared words. But English is a Germanic language that has influences from primarily French and from Latin, obviously, and Greek, and then from French and a little bit from Spanish, even a little bit from Arabic, because of the influence that the Arab civilization had on Western Europe in particular. So when you go from a language like Chinese to English, then you're in a completely different category of translation, because these are two very, very different languages, and yet, because they are languages, they're very similar. So that's paradoxical, but it's the truth. When you have a language like Arabic, you're going to, because it's a language and because human beings are thinking creatures, and we think with the same apparatus, which is the intellect, and because of that, we are going to have the same concepts. And if you get into metaphysical understanding, in traditional metaphysics, this is not true anymore in modern philosophy, but in traditional metaphysics, concepts precede language. So thought actually precedes language. Language becomes a vehicle for thought. And this is, Adam alayhi salam was given allama Adam al-asma. So he was taught how to name, but the concepts he had to have understood. They precede the naming. So when he saw a camel, he could see the universal in the particular. And so language is a profoundly spiritual. It is the single most spiritual expression of our nature, because we are, as the Arabs say, hayawan natiq. You know, they didn't say hayawan aqil like they say in Greek. They actually chose to say natiq, that we are the speaking animal as opposed to the rational animal. I mean, they obviously met rational, but the fact that they chose speaking to express the rationality is quite extraordinary. And so if you take a word like tufah, if I say to you tufah, the concept comes to your mind. Just my mere saying tufah evokes the concept of a tufah in your mind. And now it might be a red apple, it might be a green apple, it might be a pink pearl apple from Italy, if you know what that is. So, but apple will come to your mind. The particular is not important. It's the universal concept in tufah. Now, if I say palm, if I say, for instance, apple in English or ringo in Japanese, for a Japanese person, they hear ringo and the apple will come to mind. It's the same apple. But if I said tufah, and they didn't know Arabic, nothing would come to mind. So the concept precedes the actual vehicle by which the concept is expressed. So translation is an attempt to take the concept embedded in that vehicle and translate it. In other words, yu'abbiru means to translate. So it's taking, it's the abar. You know, there's a ma'bara, and this is why Arabic, al-a'rab, they're the people of i'rab, yu'ribu amma fi damirihim. And so the translator is translating concepts. So if we're speaking Arabic, إذا نتكلم العربية فبإمكاني أن أحدثكم بالعربية وأعبر ما في ضميري بلغة العرب وأنتم تفهمون لأنكم عرب. But if I take that and those same ideas, now I speak to you in the English language and you can understand it because I'm speaking English and you're English speakers. So I can say the same things in these different languages. Or es posible, si hablo en español y tú conoces español, es posible nosotros hablemos en español. So any language, the mere fact that it's the concepts that are being expressed through the vehicle of language, we can communicate. We can even communicate despite the differences of our tongues. And the Quran in Surah Al-Rum makes it clear that in our complexions, you know, fi alsinatina wa alwanina, you know, these are signs of God. And the fact that he uses ayat, because language is it's a sign. That's exactly what it is. And color is a sign, because a sign indicates something else. So if I see you as a darker person, then that's a sign that you're from a southern hemisphere generally. If I see you as a light-skinned person, it's a sign that you're from a northern hemisphere, at least originally. And maybe if you're in that middle area, although you have very light-skinned Berbers, that you're from that middle area. So language is also a sign. So it tells us, it indicates something, and we're signifiers. So to get to translation in a really deep sense is very difficult. And I can tell you, as somebody who's been at the United Nations and actually did translations that I gave to the translators to use, I know for a fact that even at the UN, the translations are often atrocious. I don't know, they're probably better in French and English, but when the Arabs speak, Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah does not speak political Arabic. He doesn't speak, you know, Lughat al-Ahram, which is what those translators are trained to translate. He speaks in a so when I was there, he was talking about al-madahib, al-mukhtarifa. So they translated madahib as differing sects, S-E-C-T-S. That's not the appropriate translation in that context. He was talking about schools of thought, not a sectarianism. And so, but that person didn't have the type of education that was necessary. So language is very difficult. And when you get into nuance, like, is your name Hadir? Like Hada Yara? With a soft ha. Hadir. Dr. Hadir. It's Hadir?
Hadir.
Yeah. So if you look at, yeah. So if you look at Hadir, okay, Hadir can mean the cooing of a pigeon, but I don't think that's what your parents intended.
No, my name, the name Hadir means the sound of the waves.
Well, it can be different things. It can,
no, exactly. The other one is Hadil with the lamb.
No. Hadir also.
No, Hadir is a louder voice than the pigeons. Hadir is the sound of the waves. My parents are from Alexandria. That's why they were fascinated with the sound of the waves.
So, but you can have Hadir al-Ra'ad.
Yes, or Hadir al-Dabbabat, unfortunately.
Or you can have Hadir al-Sabi.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, well, you can look in a dictionary, you'll find it.
I know that at least what they meant is hadir, the sound of the waves. This is what.
Yeah. So hadir, that was their intention. So when you have a language like Arabic, Arabic is a very interesting language in that sometimes it's extraordinarily precise. And so you can't have an alternate explanation. And other times it's extraordinarily ambiguous. And so, for instance, if you take a word like jawr, jawr is it's only mentioned once in the Quran in the ishtiqaq. It's mentioned as ja'ir. But if you take the word jawr, jawr is dhulm from somebody in a position of power. So in English, it would be closer to tyranny than oppression. And so you talk about jawr sultan. So if you look, for instance, in the Tahawiyah, which I translated, he says, وَلَا نَدْعُوا عَلَىٰ أَئِمَّتِنَا وَإِنْ جَارُوا عَلَيْنَا. He didn't say وَإِنْ ظَلَمُونَا, because he was being very precise about the use of jawr. He's talking about political oppression and not just dhulm, which can happen. A husband can have dhulm of the wife or vice versa, right? So finding these to be a really, really good translator, and I'm not talking about translating, just oral translation when you're doing spontaneous translation, for instance, which can be quite taxing and difficult. And I've done it, and I don't like to do it because it's very exhausting, especially when you're having to keep up with the speaker. If they're speaking fast, it becomes really difficult.
But Shaykh, I saw you interpreting for Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah.
Many times. Many times,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's very exhausting.
It is.
I would much rather translate his talk, and I do this very often. If he has a talk, I'll translate it before, because he's very eloquent as a speaker. And you do a grave disservice to a speaker who's extremely eloquent when you're not translating in a type of language that somehow mirrors or at least reflects in some way the beauty of the language that the person is speaking. And so eloquence, balagha, is much easier to do when you can sit down and really think, and you have a thesaurus, and you have a dictionary, and you can think about it. So, it just, in conclusion, in the concluding remarks before we get into a conversation, I would say that, Arabic, what you need to know to be a good translator from Arabic, not into Arabic, because it's always easier to translate into your native tongue. It's actually very few people that learn a language as a second language are good at translating into that language. There are those that really do learn it, but it's much easier to go into your native tongue than from your native tongue into the language that you've learned. So if you take the English language, the English language is an amalgam of several different languages. It's primarily Germanic. Arabic is a much purer language. The amount of loan words in the Arabic language is actually surprisingly small. It's probably increased in the last 100 years more than in the last 2,000 years. And traditionally, Jewish scholars had to learn Arabic to get to the Semitic roots of Hebrew, because it was the Arabs and really the Persians, but I mean, Al-Farahidi is the first, Al-Khalil. It was the Arabs who really created the science of lexicons. I mean, the first truly scientific dictionaries come out of the Arabic language. And prior to that, you had some dictionaries in China, you had some dictionaries in India, but dictionary was a very primitive subject before the Muslims. And the Jews did not start writing dictionaries until after they saw what the Muslims were doing. And they didn't analyze their language until after they saw what the Persians had done with Arabic. Like, they didn't know that language was built on root stems. It's pretty amazing what they learned from the Arab. So to be a good translator from Arabic into English, you really have to learn a lot of different subjects. There's 12 subjects that you need to learn to be a mufassir. To be a translator, there's at least 4 that you have to be seriously engaged with. And I would say nahw, and I'll include sarf in that. Nahw and sarf as a language is very, very important. You also have to know ishtiqaq, the etymology and derivations, because it's very important to understand a word in a deep sense. You also have to know what they call diction, which is word choice. So vocabulary is extremely important. And there's passive and active vocabulary. So vocabulary, many of us, our active vocabularies are very limited, but as an educated person, we should have a very large passive vocabulary so that we can understand words. And then you have to know rhetoric. Balagha is extremely important. And at Zaytuna, students have to take balagha in both English and Arabic. And then finally, I would say you should really read a lot of poetry. And the reason for that is the best way to penetrate a language is to study its poetry, because poetry is language charged to the maximum. Great poets they're working with language exponentially. Everybody else is working with language arithmetically, but poets are working with language geometrically. So if you can master translating poems, everything else becomes very easy. And that's why it's good as an exercise to do things like the mu'allaqat or some of the great al-Mutanabbi or some of the great poets. And in diction, I would add also what they call fiqh al-lugha, which is also the same for English, because if you go into a dictionary, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you have all these different meanings. Like hadir is a good example. So if you look in a dictionary, you're going to have all these type hadara, hadara sabiyu, hadara al-ra'd, hadarat al-amwaj. You're going to have all these different, and so what is it in the context of what you're trying to translate? And when you get, like, wajh is a good example. Wajh in Arabic is a very hard word to translate because it's used for so many different different meanings, especially when you get into these classical writers. They're using words very specifically and to try to get to what, and that's why the shuruh, I mean, Muslims created an entire tradition of glossaries because it was so important to have commentaries on things. The Prophet ﷺ's language is extremely subtle, and his word choice is sallallahu alaihi wasallam is very purposeful. Why he would choose one word over another word, and then getting into finally the glue words, and the glue words are going to be the most difficult words that you learn, but they're extremely important because glue words, and I'm talking linguistically about ma'ani al-huruf. The glue words are the most difficult words for artificial intelligence. So they have real problems with prepositions, because if you look like a preposition like fi has 10 different meanings in Arabic. If you look in Mughni al-Labib by Ibn Hisham, fi has 10 different meanings. Min has 12 different meanings. Is it min al-tab'id? Is it min al-ibtida? Is it min al-bayan? You know, these are all different meanings. So when the Prophet ﷺ said, you know, man atba'a Ramadan bi sittatin min Shawwal, that min, the fuqaha differed on it. Some said he meant beginning in Shawwal, but you could do it any time of the year. That's Imam Malik's opinion. Imam Shafi'i said, no, it's only in Shawwal, because there he said it was minu tab'id. It was a partitive min. It wasn't a min al-ibtida, like ataytu min Mekkata. That's ibtida'an, min Mekkata. But if I said akaltu min al-khubz, right, that's a partitive. So these are very difficult words to penetrate in any language, but in particular in the Arabic language. So I'll end with that and open it up.
Thank you very much, Shaykh, for this insightful presentation, which will, of course, frame the discussion. And I know that it has provoked so many things, so many questions with the participants. But I would like to start from one statement you made. You said, rightly, that Arabic is much more pure as a language than other languages like English. So this purity makes it more a language of the one nation. But the Quran says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن جعلناه قرآنا عربيا لعلكم تعقلون. So my question is, how would you interpret that verse? Especially with regard to the dichotomy between the locality of the language for one nation versus the universality of the message of Islam. Do you take this verse as an implicit invitation or endorsement or even encouragement or obligation of the exercise of translation into other languages? And how would you interpret لعلكم تعقلون in this particular context? So جعلناه قرآنا عربيا means in Arabic, and it is meant to be for the universe. So how the message is going to be as you mentioned earlier, lated or transmitted?
Sure. Well, first of all, you know, Arabic is a well-known family of languages from the Arabian Peninsula. You had different, you know, there's, as you know, there's three Arabs. There's al-Arab al-Ba'id, there's the Arab al-Ariba, and then there's the Arab al-Musta'riba. So the language of Quran is in the language of the Arab al-Musta'riba. You know, these are the latter Arabs that learned Arabic from the Jarahima. Who originally from Yemen, Semitic peoples from the north. When they moved into Arabia, Ismail being the father of these people, they learned Arabic. So that language has different dialects, and so, for instance, Ihan in Arabic, which is mentioned in the Quran, most of the Arabs did not know that word. That was a Qurayshi word. It meant suf masbugh. It had to be dyed wool. So in the Mus'haf of Ibn Mas'ud, he said kasuf al-manfush as a translation for the other Arabs to understand it. But it loses the nuance of being dyed by translating it into suf, which was common to the other Arabs. And so the nuances of the Quran can only be understood with a deep understanding of the Arab. So for instance, kaid in Arabic, you know, if you look at kaid, inna kaydakum azim, you know, your kaid is vast. You know, kaid is different from makar. Makar and kaid are similar, but they're not synonyms. And kaid is a stronger word than makar. The Arabic word makar needs a preposition, makara bihi, whereas kaduhu, you can go straight to, and as you know, a language weakens, the meaning weakens when you have it becomes more intransitive. To make it transitive with a preposition diminishes the strength of the verb. In the same way that you know, the ziyada tadullu ala ziyadat al-ma'na. So whenever you add letters to something, it like ghafir, if you go to ghaffar, it strengthens the meaning of that. So these type things are very important to understand about the Arabic language. And when Allah says that He made Ja'ala itself, there's a huge debate in the early history of Aqidah between the Mu'tazila and between the Ash'ira and the Maturidiyya about the meaning of Ja'ala, because the Mu'tazila argued that Ja'ala meant khalaqahu Qur'anan Arabiyan, whereas the Ja'ala to the others meant something very different, that the vehicle in which al-ma'ani al-qadima يعني عبرت بها، هذا هو الجعل الذي جعله الله سبحانه وتعالى قرآنا عربيا. لعلكم is حرف توقيع, and when Allah uses it, it also can mean that it's you know, that it's going to happen. So لعلكم تعقلون, and then you get into what is aql, like, because aql is not intellect in the modern sense of the word. You know, the aqil, you know, if you look at the root meaning of aql, it comes from to bind a camel. You know, aqal al-jamal bil-iqal. And so and if you look at all the words in Arabic, like nuha comes from to prevent something. You know, hijr is also hajara, to stop something. So words that in Arabic deal with intellect very often deal with something that restrains you. And so we put this into a Quranic Arabic that perhaps you might understand it and thus enter into the hudud of Allah, to restrain yourselves from harm. Why? Because, you know, لَعَلَكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, that perhaps you might protect yourselves. And so the aql is for two things. It's for jalb al-masalih wa dar al-mafasid. It's to accrue benefit and to ward off harm. That's the essence of why God's given us an intellect. And so the Quran is a book that can be understood at many, many levels, and Arabic is the vehicle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to reveal His book, because it is a deeply nuanced language that enables extraordinary possibility of meaning to emerge that you won't find in other languages. I mean, I think the languages of Revelation tend to share some commonalities. Hebrew is a very profound language. Also, some of the ancient languages like Sanskrit and probably Chinese. You know, Heidegger thought Greek had that capacity, but I don't think that's true. Greek is it's a secondary language. It comes out of the ancient Indic language. So,
thank you very much, Sheikh. We are going to take now the questions of the participants. I can see. Sheikh, do you like we take them in rounds or in questions, one by one?
I would rather do one by one, if you don't mind.
Okay, please, yeah. Sami, please.
Thank you very much, Hammouda. Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh.
Alaikum
I'm Sami Wayed Benjaloun from Brussels. I feel very privileged to have this opportunity to talk to you, since I've been following you since years. I've read your books, last of which I think was one of your old books called The Purification of the Heart.
Yeah.
Very interesting book. Thank you very much. I have two questions. The first question regarding as an interpreter of Shaykh bin Bayyah, because I had the privilege to interpret Shaykh bin Bayyah in Berlin in 2017 when he came to to Berlin. You weren't there with him. I was very disappointed, by the way, because I wish to meet you on that occasion. And I found it very difficult to interpret him because when he was giving his speech from the rostrum, it was okay because he was reading, so his Arabic was classical. He takes the floor to answer a question when he improvises. We know that he comes from Mauritania. He doesn't speak very loudly. And sometimes it's very difficult for interpreter to hear what he says. So I'd like to hear your experience about that specific topic. How did you deal with his dialect?
Yeah.
And how did you deal with the articulation of speech with Shaykh bin Bayyah? I just want to precise that I'm Arabic and French mother tongues, and I have English as a passive language. So I interpret from Arabic into French and from French into Arabic as my classic combination of other languages as well. Regarding your first or the first things you said about the process of translation, which you described as the past signified from this. That in order to be a translator, we have at least master 4 out of 12 disciplines, which are grammar.
I think seriously engaged.
Yeah, okay.
You know,
do you think that
seriously engaged? Yeah. Mastery is a very difficult.
I totally agree with you. Do you because these 4 disciplines, it seems to me that they relate only to the vehicle. Don't you think that for a translator or for an interpreter, because we have to do that spontaneously, as you said, we say simultaneously, don't you think that we have also to have quite a lot of knowledge in order to be able to transfer or to extract the signified from the significant?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the first question with Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah is, I spent years with him, so I've gotten used to him. I still, every once in a while, have a hard time catching the word.
This is what I had.
Yeah. So he tends to he knows his vocal sometimes. So I didn't catch it. That he's very good at. Sometimes he'll get a little frustrated with me because he's thinking at such a high. He's at warp speed. His intellect, and so if you kind of stumble on, it's going to disrupt his chain of thought. So for him, he prefers that I let him speak and then stop, which I prefer doing it line by line, just to keep up with him, because the thing about Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah, he doesn't waste words, and he uses words. I've never met anybody that has the level of Arabic that he has, and I've met some really great masters of Arabic, but I actually know quite a bit about what he actually knows in Arabic, and so he's a difficult person to translate.
Very.
And he's also, like, I used to hear him, and I would think he made a mistake in morphology, like his sarf, because he would pronounce it a way that I had learned it another way. Like I'd learn yakhdumu and he'd say yakhdimu. And so when I'd go back and look at the dictionaries, I'd found he was always right. It was just he was using a different pattern. So I stopped looking him up to realize he's not making mistakes there. I mean, if you look at when he speaks Arabic, it's quite extraordinary, because even great scholars make mistakes and have lahan. The Mauritanians have a proverb, that it's just Arabic's a really hard language in that way. So that's what I would say about that. And then Shaykh is also working from a lot of different knowledges, and if you don't know like he uses, if you study logic, you want to end out earlier. One of the things I wanted to say is that there's essentially two types of, in terms of ulum, that you're going to be translating. One of the ulum has very transparent words in the other language. So for instance, mantiq, by and large, is almost entirely translatable into English if you've studied mantiq in both languages. So for instance, there's somebody who translated a book on logic from Arabic here, and he translated khamsatu alfaz as 5 utterances. And that's because he didn't know that the actual, in English, it's the 5 predicables. Like there's a specific term for that resides in both languages. So that's very important for a translator to know the science he's translating into. Because if you don't know biology, you shouldn't be translating a lecture by a biologist.
Exactly.
And you have to. So from that point of view, I'm assuming. Cicero said that an orator should have a vast, what they call in rhetoric, copia. This copiousness knowledge enables them to translate. People, if they watch me translate for Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah, and I think you can learn a lot from the translations. Just I'm talking to the students, not you, but that you can learn a lot by listening to those. Because I know, like the Minister of Awqaf told me that he learned quite a bit of English from listening to those. And they're not perfect far, but because I'm familiar and I've studied most of the subjects that he's speaking about, I do have a sense of where they go. It's not always the best choice because a lot of these sciences, like al-hadith, that is a specifically Muslim science. And so to find like muqtarib or munqata' or wahan or matruk, or these are specific technical terms that are in some ways best left in the original with an explanation in a footnote. So those are the type of things that I think.
If I can just add an extra question, and indeed, when you talk,
please, yes.
Hammouda, just one extra question, if you allow me, of course.
Please go
indeed, and there is another side of the problem. It is when you have to translate an Islamic book or an Islamic document from a foreign language into Arabic. I've been tasked to translate a book from French into Arabic called The Invention of Islam. The problem was, and it spoke about hadith, so I had to find again the right mustalahat al-hadith that correspond to the French solution that the French writer has chosen for those words. So it was quite acrobatic. My last question, if I may, do you believe, as a native English speaker, translating from Arabic classic works, that a non-native has the instruments to translate classic works into a foreign language?
I think most do not. Like, in order to translate classical texts, you have to have studied within the tradition, because you'll miss way too much. And we can see it in the Orientalist works. Many of the Orientalists were really brilliant scholars, and they knew Arabic to a very high degree, but because they did not study in the tradition, they make egregious mistakes.
Totally agree.
And also I've noticed a lot of mistakes with prepositions, because they're very nuanced prepositions.
That's what I say to my students all the time.
And I mean, I'll give you an example. I'll give you a really good example. I was reading a really good tahqiq of the Tasheel of Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi. And that book has suffered from bad editions. It's a beautiful tafsir. It's one of my favorite tafsirs. And so I was reading the introduction to the tafsir, and there was it was about Ibn Juzay when he was martyred. He was with the Al-Wazir Dhul Lisanain, and he quotes these lines of poetry, and then he says he uses the term ayman al-kuffar in his thing, like the, you know, that to be martyred at the ayman al-kuffar, like the right hands of the kuffar, meaning a ta'an, like darb. And so the minister said to him, ataj'alu lil-kuffari aymana? Like, you're giving them ayman, like you should use a better word than that. So. And then he says, and then the person who that's what it said. وَالْحُطَمَاتُ فِي النَّاسِ أَيْدَ الْكُفَّارِ. So he did not see that. I couldn't make hide nor hair of what he was saying, because hutama is one of the names of hell, you know. So is it وَالْحُطَمَاءُ فِي النَّاسِ, you know, hell is with the people, or what? I didn't know what he was saying. It was actually a jumla i'tiradiyya. It was وَالْحَطْمَةُ فِي النَّاسِ, يعني الزحمة. They were in so that man who's a professor of Islamic sciences in Mecca completely misread that. He thought it was Ibn Juzay that was saying وَالْحُطَمُ فِي النَّاسِ, but that was a jumla i'tiradiyya of you know, what we'd call a non-restrictive clause, you know, inside, embedded in there. It should have had like hyphens, right, on or M dash on each side. So even people that are really trained have a hard time with, and hence we have this massive hawashi tradition. You know, they say man la yahfaz al-mutun yantammas والذي ما قرأ الحواشي ما حوى شيء. You know, like, so going into tradition and some subject that you have not studied seriously, because huge mistakes, and we can see it in the books. I see mistakes all the time.
So we are
even in the Quran.
We're in the problem.
Even in Quranic, I'll give you one example. The first place that I go to in any translation of Quran is in chapter 42, Shura, verse 11, because it says, you know, the first half of the verse is about azwaj, but the second half it says, وَلَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. I always go to look how, and almost invariably they translate that wow as a conjunction. And it's not a conjunction. It's wow with isti'naf. And so that indicates they don't know Arabic well enough to be translating the Quran. Because if you say and he is, that's ma'tuf ala ma sabaqahu, so you're giving Allah a mithal. Right? So when you say laysa kamithlihi shay, and yet, you know, or yet, there has to be some indication that there's a break from these two statements.
Yeah.
Fight that.
We are in a very extreme problem, because we need to understand at the same time
well, I think a non-Arab, and he was a master and a beautiful stylist. Muhammad al-Ghazali was a Persian, lest we forget. He's a beautiful stylist. Some of the greatest scholars of Islam who wrote in Arabic were not native Arab speakers. Avicenna, who is not the greatest of writers, his style is not a high style. But he's one of the most brilliant human beings, and his works are very important still. So, but the sine qua non for me is that they have to have studied to a high level the subject that they want to translate into another language, and they should know the other language well enough to do that, because mediocrity, the world is filled with mediocrity, but to do something really of weight or worth is not that easy.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sami, for the questions. Mohammed Zahoud, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Salhi and Shaykh Hamza, for this great talk about many issues that we translators have to be discussed with Sami, who was just completed his questions. I have only one comment. I hear that Shaykh Hamza mentioned before that most translators are supposed to translate into their mother tongue. And as far as I know, and from a translation theory perspective, I would like to comment on this issue by saying that this issue is still controversial and debatable among.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah, among translators.
I'm talking from my own experience and from what I've seen, so it's more anecdotal than scientific.
Well, yes, I totally agree, and the perspective of those who are saying that translators are supposed to translate from their mother tongue into the foreign language is that the most important step in translation process is to fully comprehend and understand the source text. And their argument is it's much easier to understand and comprehend a text that's written in your own language. And therefore, once you understood and comprehended the text, you can transfer it into the foreign language.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I myself, for example, I have recently two published translations. One of them is available on Amazon. It's entitled I Die Every Day, 10 Libyan Short Stories, or 10 Libyan Tales. It was co-translated with a friend of mine from Britain. And we translated this from Arabic into English. And the first draft of the translation was mine. My colleague was only revising the translation and doing some proofreading, if this is okay. So the argument is still debatable. I wanted more comments from your side, since you are translator.
I'm glad you brought this up. So let me unpack that a little bit. One, I would argue that in spontaneous translation, when you're doing UN type translation, it's a disaster for somebody who has a heavy accent to be translating into a native tongue, another tongue that's not their native tongue. So for instance, one of the reasons Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah likes me to translate into English is because it's my native tongue and people can understand it. We know social science indicates that 25% of people have a difficult time with foreign accents. So you're losing 1/4 of the people in a room when you have a strong foreign accent. And this is palpable, like people experience this. It can also distract a person from actually listening to what's being said. Having said that, I would say in terms of classical Arabic, it's purely a matter of how well they've studied and how well they know the language they're translating into or from. In terms of Naguib Mahfouz, nobody could really translate that except a native Egyptian speaker. And I would argue if your stories from Libya involve dialectical Libyan, you know, I mean, as I might know what Shnunjowek means or something like that, or say Bahi, you know, if somebody asked me from Libya, but that's the extent of my Libyan dialect, you know. So I'm not going to attempt to translate a book of Libyan stories if they're in the Libyan dialect. If I can translate Al-Kharoubi, and I've done that, who was a great Libyan scholar, or Al-Hattab, who was a great Libyan scholar, I'd feel very comfortable translating their works. So I think, you know, I made a blanket statement, but that statement has to be unpacked, you know, and I would argue that it just depends on what you're translating and what the qualifications of the translator are.
Thank you. Just to, I'm Tunisian and Libya is next door. And I had to service an assignment so many years ago in Libya in a company that is working in public constructions. And I know from the hotel restaurants that a spoon is called kashik in Libyan dialect. And then I was called by the manager of that company, branch manager, to interpret a conversation between him and a local Libyan engineer. And then the engineer said, we then used the kashik to do something in the jetty. And really that was a turning point in my career in translation, because I assume that I know the Libyan dialect quite well because we were receiving the transmission of TV, especially during summertime before satellite. And then luckily I was translating consecutively, means sentence by sentence, like you prefer. And I had the chance to ask the engineer, what do you mean by kashik? And it turned out to be the bulldozer, which is another meaning of kashik. So with that, I give
it's a spoon. It's like a spoon.
Exactly, yeah.
It's lifting the dirt.
True. So this is the culture that we need to know also to translate. But another question to you, Shaykh. Don't you think that the privilege of you translating for Shaykh bin Bayyah is that you know him quite well. You travel with him. And so you know your author. Not only because you are a native speaker of English, that the message is clearly laid down in English, but also you understand quite well, because this is the first phase in translation. You have to understand the message, what is being said, the nuances, the discourse behind it.
I've studied with him for years. I've read books with him. I've had many conversations with him. I understand Hassaniya relatively well, so when he slips into Hassaniya, I can understand, you know, the dialect.
Thank you. Yes, Muhammad Asi, please. You are muted, Muhammad. Can you please?
Okay.
Unmute your mic. Yes.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamza. Thank you, Dr. Hammouda. It is a privilege, really, as Sami said, it's a privilege and honor to take part in this lecture. My name is Muhammad Asi. I'm an interpreter, staff interpreter at the United Nations. I've had a long career in interpreting and translation before I became staff interpreter. My question is about synonyms. We all know that synonyms is not something that we can rely on. For the definition of a synonym is a word or a phrase that means exactly or nearly the same as another word or phrase. It's not the same. Synonyms do not exist, and I think that is an erroneous concept that was the basis of so many false interpretation of the Quran. I will give examples. For example, the word nazzalna wa anzalna. Those are two words which are almost identical, but they have different meanings.
Yeah.
We have that problem in particular when interpreting religious texts. So I don't think we would use the same word in English for أنزلنا الحديد أو إنا نحن نزلنا الذكر وإنا له لحافظون. هناك أيضا كلمات أخرى كبلغ وأبلغ. وقد تبدو, it may seem that these two words are the same for those who have adopted.
No, I agree with you.
So what is your comment on that? I believe that it is the same thing in English or French or any
Well, I think, Hamza, may I add something else, please? You comment within the same idea. A previous talk, there was a question raised about the difference between Nasara and Masihiyin and how to translate them into English. Nasara, Nasrani, or Masihiyin. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so first of all, I agree generally with that concept that synonyms, there's a reason why words are different. Is freedom and liberty, are they the same words? You know, freedom is from the German frei, and liberty is from the Latin libertas. So some people make distinctions. Is work and labor different? You know, some people say labor is the body and work is like a manager works, but the factory worker is actually a laborer, you know, doing labor. These are distinctions that you get into fiqh al-lugha. A lot of fiqh al-lugha has been lost. And as modern people, we are far less specific in our language than ancient peoples. Ancient peoples used words very precisely. One of the things you'll note with children is they really like to use words precisely, and they actually get upset when you use words. So for instance, I mean, I'll just give you an example of my 5-year-old. I once told him, put on your shoes, and he looked at me and said, those aren't shoes, they're boots.
You're right, yeah, you're right.
And because a boot is not a shoe, and a shoe is not a sandal. And yet, footwear is footwear. So the concept is very similar. And in that way, language, we lose these distinctions because of the similarities of the concept. So an example, I mean, you're right. Anzala is to come down at one time. Nazzala is tanzilan, it's over a period of time. Those are nuances of the language. So how do we translate that? You can translate it with a phrase or a clause, or you could try to find if there is a word in English, and this takes real work to do this well. People ask me, oh, why don't you translate the Quran? And I'm just like, first of all, you can't translate the Quran, but you cannot translate the Quran. And Arbery is one of the few scholars that made that distinction, because his Quran says an interpretation, because translators ultimately are interpreting. In terms of synonyms, some synonyms are close enough that it's not a problem. It's not going to create any confusion, like freedom and liberty. Some people argue that liberty is a political concept and freedom is just the general concept of freedom. You can make those distinctions, but they tend to work as give me liberty or give me death, give me freedom or give me death. I mean, that works. Both of those work. Liberty sounds a little nicer. Maybe it's a higher, grander style. So, but I agree with you. You know, there's infajarat, you know, in the Quran, when Allah says infajarat ithnata ashara aina, you know, and then inbajasat. Infajarat is to come out flowing. Inbajasat is to begin flowing and then diminish. And if you get into the commentaries, they say that before their sinfulness, there was an infijar, but after their sinfulness, there was an imbijas. So these are very subtle distinctions. In Arabic, for instance, qawm, the word qawm in Arabic is not sha'b, and it's not, you know, qabila. Qawm is specifically the patrilineal aspect of somebody's lineage. So your qawm are your fathers, and the Arabs are patrilineal in that way. There are some matriarchal or matrilineal societies, but not many. So the Arabs yunsab ila abihi, and those are his qawm. So in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ asked, Hal fina gharib? And they said, Fulan min al-akhwat, like he wasn't from the qawm. And the Prophet said, Ibn al-ukht min al-qawm. So he was indicating that there's still a wala. Even though the word qawm is not appropriate, there's a wala. So he's saying, min al-qawm, lil bayan, and we can trust him. And so in the Quran, in Surah Saf, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Isa, all the prophets say, Ya qawmi. But when Isa speaks to Bani Israel, he says, Ya Bani Israel. He doesn't say Ya qawmi, because they're not his qawm, because he's not in the patrilineal line. And that's why in Surah Al-Hujarat, in 49, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he says, La yasqar qawmun min qawm. وَلَا نِسَاءٌ مِّن نِسَاء, because the nisa are not the qawm. So Allah distinguishes between qawm and nisa. Those are difficult things to translate.
نعم ممكن أعلق بكلمة واحدة فقط يعني
تفضل
لو سمحت.
تفضل.
شورت. أعتقد أن موضوع الترادف جاء أصلا من الشعراء، وكان يعني معظم المفسرين كانوا شعراء يتقنون اللغة العربية ويحفظونها عن ظهر قلب. فإذا كان يعني نظم الشاعر قصيدة بائية وأراد أن يستخدم أب فيستخدم أب، إن كانت دالية سيستخدم والد، وبالنسبة له الأب هو الوالد. ونحن نعرف أنه فيما يتعلق في النص القرآني كلمة أب تختلف كليا عن كلمة والد. فهذه يعني هذا هو الأساس في الأخطاء، ونحن نعاني من هذا.
That's when you get into fiqh al-lugha. Because, for instance, in the Quran, al-Ma'idah has to have food on it. So it's properly translated by Arbery as table spread. It
is not a table.
It's a table spread, which is food with a table with food on it.
No.
If it doesn't have food, it's called a khuwan, because it's خاوي من الأكل.
يعني أنا أقول لا ضير في أن تستخدم المترادفات سواء كانت متقاربة أو متباعدة في الشعر أو النثر، ولكن اعتماد هذا المبدأ في النص القرآني أو نص الحديث الشريف أعتقد أنه يسيء للمعنى العام، وبالتالي ستكون الترجمة.
Well, also if you look at the aldad, which are very interesting, like in the Quran when Allah says وَصُبْحِ إِذَا عَسْعَسْ, so عَسْعَسَ is يُقْبِلُ وَيُدْبِرُ. It's from so it means both. That ayah, how do you translate that? Because I think it's indicating that subh is always bal and midbar.
الإنجليزية التي يمكن أو الفرنسية التي يمكن أن يستخدمها الواحد منا للتعبير عن معنى كهذا. أعتقد أن هذا يكون صعبا جدا في الترجمة الفورية، قد يكون أقل صعوبة في الترجمة التحريرية، لأن هناك وقتا للمراجعة والسؤال والتدقيق والتنقيح إلى آخره والبحث. أما في الترجمة الفورية وهي مهنتي ومهنة البعض مثل سامي والأخ حمودة، هذه بالنسبة لنا معضلة وليس فقط في النص الديني على فكرة يعني.
Well, I'll give you an example. You know, Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah, he talks about هذا لابد أن يأتي من رحم الإسلام. You know, how would you translate rahm here? You know, it's womb is not correct, because it's actually the matrix, which if you look in the Latin meaning of matrix, it's womb from the mother. So it's the proper translation.
Mute.
Yes,
Hello?
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, so
thank you very much.
Yeah, so those, these are subtleties. I mean, language is very subtle. For those of you who who are working with English, I would highly recommend 2 books. One of them is the Scribner Bantam English Dictionary. And I'll tell you why. If you go into this dictionary, they will give you all the fiqh al-lugha. So for instance, feeling, adjective, possessing or showing great sensibility, easily affected, sympathetic, noun, any of the cutaneous senses, commonly called touch, by which contact, pressure, temperature, and pain are perceived. 4, act of perceiving or state of one who perceives by touch. 5, sensation received otherwise than through sight, hearing, taste, or smell. 6, emotion. 7, power to experience sympathy, tenderness, or the like. 8, belief or conviction. 9, animating spirit, as in a work of art which calls forth an emotional response. 10, feelings, plural, sensitiveness or susceptibility. Feelingly, adverb. Synonyms. Now look at the synonyms. Sense, sensation, sensitiveness, sensibility, susceptibility, emotion, sentiment, passion. Now, discrimination. So they go into discrimination. Feeling is a general term for the experience of senses and may include aspects of perception other than those derived from sight, hearing, smell, or taste. The means of awareness through bodily perceptions are called the senses. The power of these senses, regarded singly as distinguished from the intellect or will, is called sense. Sensation is the physical feeling resulting from the operation of the senses. We have sensations of chill, creepiness, deafness, dizziness, and the like. Sensibility, popularly, is the quick and acute capacity for feeling of any kind. Sensibility, so when you look at Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, sensibility is Marianne because it's the quick and acute capacity for feeling. Eleanor is the sense, right? Which is the power of perception. So anyway, he goes on. My point is, this is a really incredible work to get into these really fun distinctions that have been lost on modern people. So this book is a wonderful resource. Unfortunately, it's out of print, but you can still get used copies online. It's called Funk and Wagnall's Standard Handbook of Synonyms, Antonyms, and Prepositions. So if you look at, it's a very nice, it has this book, I love this book. So it'll have like a word like disease, and then it'll give you all of the words that are similar: affection, ailment, complaint, disorder, distemper, illness, indisposition, infirmity, malady. But then it goes into the differences. So this is really fiqh al-lugha. And unfortunately, these things are lost. But for those of us who love language and want to keep these distinctions alive and recognize the incredible importance of these distinctions, and I really feel like a translator that's committed to their craft, is in a lifelong process of mastering these distinctions.
Thank you, Shaykh. Thank you, Muhammad Asi, for the questions. Now I give the floor to Wa'il bin Ali. Wa'il, please.
Hi, Shaykh Hamza. Well,
Well,
I have comment regarding the words you gave, makr and kaid. Actually, you are completely right when you said that they are similar but not synonyms. You said also that the word kaid can stand by itself, إن كيدهن عظيم, while the word makr needs a preposition, ومكر به. The word makr does not necessarily need a preposition. It can also stand by itself.
that's true. That's true. But generally, the Quran uses it with preposition.
Yes, it has been said in the Quran, وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. As you can see, the verb makara is not followed.
But there it's intransitive. You see, it's intransitive there. So as a transitive verb, in order for it to take an object, it needs a preposition.
Yeah.
So there's a big difference.
Thank you.
Can you explain?
I think the point is clear, Wael. Thank you. Nada, please. Nada bin Wael.
Thank you very much for the insights. It's such an honor to take part in this lecture. My intervention is just a small taqib, let's say, on your statement that Quran cannot be translated. So the dichotomy of translability and translability, because in Arabic words, not only words provide for ambiguity and a multiplicity of meaning or interpretations, but also the same word or the same sentence can be problematic. Like in the verse, إنما يخشى الله من عباده العلماء. So the haraka as well as التقديم والتأخير matter, and any change can extremely flip the meaning. Also in the verse قالت نملة يا أيها النمل
ادخلوا مساكنكم.
نعم. There are 4 acts of speech in this very sentence. So if we translate it, maybe we can not only distort the meaning, but maybe we cannot deliver the message in the same eloquent style.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, good. I two تعقيبات على تعقيبك. The first is that خشية إنما يخشى الله من عبادي العلماء. So your point is well taken, because in Arabic تأخيم and تقدير is a very problematic. As all of you know, in reading Arabic, you start a sentence and you think it's active, but then you get to something, you realize the verb was passive. That happens a lot in Arabic, and then you have you have things like والقمر قدرناه والقمر قدرناه. Both of them are qira'at in Arabic, and they are nuanced in that meaning. For instance, in Surah Al-Hujurat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِن جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا. There's a qira'ah sab'iyya, which is فَتَثَبَّتُوا. They're both actually part of the Quran. So which one do you use and which one do you translate, or do you translate both? If you look at, for instance, that the Prophet ﷺ, it says that he wasn't, he's khatam al-nabiyyin. So in Warsh, he's khatim with a kasra. In Hafs, he's khatam with a fatha. Khatam means a seal. It's a ism ala in Arabic. Khatim means the last. If you look at the Qadianiyya in Pakistan, that whole movement is based on not knowing the qira'at, because they argued that the Prophet was khatam and not the last, because Ghulam Ahmad didn't know the qira'at, despite the fact that he was a scholar. You know, he memorized the Quran. And then also, like, khashya is only with knowledge. You can't say al-kalbu yakhshani. You can say al-kalbu yakhafuni. But you can't say, and that's why innama, which is, as you all know, harful hasri, innama, the only ones that truly have this khashya are the ulama, because you can't have khashya without ilm.
Thank you, Shaykh. Ula, please.
Yes, thank you, postdoctors, for this fruitful denoting the idea of the idea of Chaucer regarding the sign, the signifier, and the signified being the sign, the actual object, and the signifier, the letters or the sounds that comes into my mind or the reader's mind, and the signified, which is the image that came into the mind. So you ended up saying that the sign is the meaning, and the signifier is the language, and the signified which is going to be the interpreting. Am I right?
The signified is the actual concept in your mind.
Not the sign? Yes, yes, you're right. Yes,
Yeah, the sign.
Yes, we're on the right track.
The sign is the vehicle by which you're conveying it.
Yes, right. So we are on the field of the signifier, which is the language.
Yeah.
So, and then you started to tell us the process while we are translating, not interpreting, translating a kind of a verse from the Quran, following it into according to the lexical level, and then we are going to furthermore to the morphological level, syntactical level, and the semantical level, and so on. So and also I would like to would like to also add the idea of قراءات, like the line that tells قل قال عن شفا وآخرها عظم وأولم ألم يسمع ضم, which exactly kind of the right قراءات that are going to follow while I'm translating an ayah or a verse. It's going to be حفص عن عاصم or any other one, or I have to stick to the people قراءات that they are following, not just حفص عن عاصم. And I also would like to ask about the how did you manage to interpret, not to translate in your own confronting that before? How did you handle that, translating verses of Quran, interpreting it, I'm sorry, not translating it, because you know interpretation it doesn't have much time to make it in calculation and tracing the actual meaning of the lexical items and morphological items and so on.
Right.
And also I would like to add something regarding the words of anzala and nazzala. I have searched it while we were together, and I found that anzala means awha bihi, and nazzala means نزل القوم أي أحلهم المنازل أو منازلهم، أو نزل الشيء أي رتبه ووضعه في موضعه أو في منزله. While I'm translating according to that, am I resorting to relative clauses to differentiate between these slight differences between these synonyms, or let us say different meanings in words? Am I doing kind of long sentences? Yes? Am I going to resort to long sentences?
There was a lot in there.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say just on a few things, because personally translating the Quran is very problematic for me. May Allah forgive us. It's His book, and when you're in a lecture and you're translating for somebody who's quoting ayahs of Quran, you know, I think just to convey the meaning is the best that you can do. You know, like I said, you know, may Allah forgive us for any mistakes that we make on that. In terms of, you know, the qira'at are very important, and there are, you know, that for instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the 22nd surah, in Surah Al-Hajj, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتَلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا. There's a sab'iyya, one of the qira'at, mutawatira, that says, أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَ with a kasra. So one puts it in the active and the other puts it in the passive. Yes. And both meanings are sound. You know, permission is granted to those who are fighting. In other words, min al-muslimin difa'an an anfusihim bi'annahum ghulimu. The other one is udhina lilladhina yuqataluna, those who have been aggressed upon, that they have a license to defend themselves. So those, you know, I mean, I think people who translate the Quran have to be aware of the qira'at, and that's a place for footnotes. But in terms of, in Tunis, you recite Warsh. In Libya, they recite Qalun. Warsh is the qira'ah that the Prophet ﷺ most used. He taught all of them.
Right.
Warsh was in his dialect, so it's in the Qurayshi dialect. And Imam Malik preferred it over all the other qira'at. He preferred Nafi'. So did Malik considered Nafi' Sunnah. And Ahmed ibn Hanbal was asked, "Ayu qira'atan tufaddilu?" And he said, "Asim Nafi' wa illa fa'asim." So Asim is Bani Tamim, and it became popular because the Abbasids adopted it, and Abu Hanifa was a rawi of Asim's qira'ah, so it became very popular. But Warsh is a beautiful qira'ah. It's more difficult. It's the one I use. It's more difficult to learn. The mudud are longer also because you have the 6 harakats. So if you're reciting it, it takes longer to recite it than it does Hafs. So I would just say that Quran is just something you with fear and trepidation, you should have a humility with the Quran. And one of the things that the people of Hadith say is that you always, when you quote a Hadith, and I forget to do this, but you really should do it, you end it by saying, "Oh, kama qal," or like that, in case you made a mistake, because the Prophet ﷺ said in a mutawatir hadith, "Man kadhaba alayya muta'ammidan falyatabawwa maq'adahu min an-nar," and that hadith is factual. It's as solid as any ayah in the Quran. So, and I heard one of the muhaddithun, was a great scholar from Mauritania, felt that anybody who has lahan in transmitting these might fall in that heat, because the Prophet never had lahan. So it's like, and kidhib in Arabic is very interesting, because when the muhaddithun say kana kadhaban, it doesn't necessarily mean that he was intentionally a liar. What it meant is that he just transmitted everything he heard without ascertaining, because of the hadith, that it's enough to call a man a liar who transmits everything he hears. So if there's no tathabbut and tahaqquq on what's being said, then you can end up being a liar.
Yes. Thank you, Shaykh, for these very insightful explanations on language and synonyms and so on. But I'm going to ask a question about the context, not the verbal and the strict context of huruf, words, synonymy.
Like siyaq.
Siyaq, exactly. The broader context and the importance of contextualization. And this is one tool in the hands of translators. They cannot transmit a message or convey something without contextualizing it in the first place. And here, I'm not speaking about the sacred text or the hadith, but even any classical text, like the text or a book by Imam al-Ghazali. And I think in one of your books, I think it is the Vision of Islam or something like that, you said that it is very dangerous to read a book by Imam al-Ghazali and not understand that Imam al-Ghazali was working in 6th century Eastern Islam. You are fortunate to know Shaykh bin Bayyah, you know him, and you can engage in a discussion with him to infer the right meaning from his what he has said and the interpretation. But you cannot engage in a dialogue with Imam al-Ghazali because he lived in a different era. So, and you cannot invoke the elements of context properly. What to do in this case to be faithful to the philosophy of a great writer like Imam al-Ghazali?
Okay, well, first of all, I'd say you're talking about context in two different ways. And so in the first sense, everything is embedded. Words are embedded in a context. Like, for instance, the context of this discussion is about me speaking with a group of translators about my own experiences in translating and maybe helping these students navigate something that at my age now I've been navigating for a long time and I can pass. So that's the context of this discussion. And that's why the subjects that we're talking about are contextualized in the context of this subject. But now you're also talking about historical context. So language is embedded in the context with which it emerges. So for instance, in Surah At-Tawbah, which comes after Al-Anfal, and some of the ulama collapsed the two together. So there's no basmala. But others said, no, the basmala is absent because of the context of the surah, that it wasn't appropriate, because in balagha they say that balagha is mutabaqat al-qawli muqtada al-hal. It should correspond to the context. That's literally what it means. And so it's not appropriate in the context of the opening of Tawbah to have Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, because it's talking about basically warfare. So that's an example of context, embedded language in context. Historical context is a completely other problem. And that is, and where we have to differentiate, and as philosophically, as an essentialist, I would argue that Ghazali is a man for all times in many things, and in some things he's a man for his time. So women that read Ghazali sometimes find ouches in Ghazali's writings, because sometimes he's really seems like he's a man of his time in the way he talks about women. But does that mean we throw him out because he has some statements that in today's sensibilities would be considered sexist? You know, I would argue that...
So, sorry, Sheikh, can you give us an example on Ghazali's view to women?
Well, if you read Bab al-Nikah, if you read, for instance, that, things like, making the remark that, a barren, a sajada in the corner of your house is better than sleeping with a barren wife. I mean, that's a pretty, that's a harsh statement, even though it's attributed to one of the Sahaba. I won't mention the name, but the point of that statement is that ibadah, is that a lot of the awliya saw sexuality as procreation, that, like the Catholics, that you went with the niyyah of procreation. Ibn Arabi, for instance, saw it as a very highly spiritual thing. And so he would say, with the right intention, sleeping with your spouse is actually an act of ibadah. So, I'm just using that as you asked for an example, so excuse me for the explicit nature of the example. But, and the other things, I mean, you just find things that are just, I think, they're just a little difficult. But overall, he's universal far more than he is particular to his time and place. And in that way, I think his words can be communicated over time. And this is why you can take a work like the 20th chapter of the Ihya on the Prophet's Fada'il. That work is for all time, and we can translate it, and we know what those words mean. Or we can take Kitab al-Ajaib al-Qalb, and that's speaking to us today, or Kasr al-Shahwatain, or Kitab al-Maut, the 40th book. I mean, I think that historical context is important to understand, but we also have to recognize much of what our Islamic tradition is grappling with are universals that are true for every time and place. And so in some ways, if you look at Ibn Taymiyyah was living at a time when the Muslim world was under siege. So he has a siege mentality. His mentality is very different from somebody who is living at a time when the Muslims were in the full height of their power. If you look, for instance, a lot of the things about Christians and Jews in our books were said at a time when the Christians and Jews were completely in a state of subjugation to the Muslims. And so they didn't feel any need to hide their feelings about this, that, or the other. We're living in a time which is the absolute opposite, And so it's important that, you know, that we follow closer to the earlier tradition of just the Prophet ﷺ was very conciliatory. He did not offend people. He did not want to offend people. But when people are in power, they tend to forget those things. And so there's a lot of things in our tradition that are very ugly, and they need to be contextualized in their historical truths. I'll give you one example. If you look at the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, that the Prophet stood for the Jew who was being taken to his funeral, and they said that it's a Yahudi, ya Rasulullah. He said, "Awalaysat nafsa?" Isn't it a soul? In the commentary, and you can see this in Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who's a great scholar. In the commentary, some of the ulama said he was standing because of the foulness of the stench. Like, how do you get that interpretation out of that? You get it because of the particularities of the time. You know, they really had a low opinion of other religions and of other peoples. That, I don't think, is the spirit of Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-An'am, لا تسبوا الذين يدعون من دون الله فيسبوا الله عدوا بغير علم. And then he says the reason, كذلك زينا لكل أمة عملهم. We have made every ummah think that what they're doing is good. Like Allah says he did that. So just like, don't curse the idols of other, like Hindu, we're not supposed to curse their idols. Because we want to reach people and share. And if you don't show respect for other people, why should they show respect for you?
Yeah. Thank you, Shaykh. I'm aware of time. Now it is almost 5 to 9 our time and 5 to 1 p.m. your time. I'm not sure if we can add a few minutes, 10 minutes perhaps, because I can see so many requests of the floor. So would you accommodate 10 or more?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Professor Muhammad Mansour, you have the floor, please. I think you are muted, Professor Muhammad. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you quite well, yes.
Okay, fine. Okay, then thanks for this opportunity, Dr. Salhi, and good evening to our speaker and to the attendees. I'd like also to thank the speaker for highlighting the fact that poetry is a language charged to the maximum. And also thanks for insisting on nuances as relating to prepositions. I know someone who wrote a full PhD dissertation on the meaning of wow. واو المعية, واو العطف, واو الاستئناف, and other wows in the language. And about synonymy also, this is an important issue. Maybe in the mu'allaqat you have synonymy, but I don't think you have synonymy in free verse. In free verse, a poet would not sacrifice the meaning for just a word that rhymes. And I have, read this poetry and I have discussed it, and I don't see in free verse, that pursuit of the musical word or the word that rhymes at the cost of the precise meaning. So maybe poetry is the place to start to really know more about nuances of meaning, as you said. Somebody called this in a previous presentation as al-lata'if, lata'iful ma'na. Now to my query. I once started a project in which I was trying to, show the favor that speakers of the language owe to translated works. That is, there are verses of the Quran. I went to a Quranic school and I really got trained, fully trained, I believe, in a Quranic school. But still, there are passages in the text which I can grasp better in translation, that is, in the English language. Not only because those people mastered the language, but also because they read different exegeses of the text and qira'at, different qira'at, etc. Now, my query is in relation to instances in the text where we have sahibah and other instances where we have imra'ah, and then instances where we find nisa as a generic term. Any thoughts on this?
Thank you, Professor, for a good question.
So, yeah, I think the great, just on the poetry, I think that the truly great masters of poetry would never, Arabic is so vast in its vocabulary that they would never have to lose the meaning in search of a rhyming word or so. I mean, there's that what they're working with, the corpus, the body of language that they're working with is it's amazing. I mean, Arabic has more vocabulary than any other language in the world. And as you know, the great poets use words that we've never heard of. We have to look them up. And one of the things I love about the humility of Arab texts is that they will often explain the words at the bottom. I wish English texts did that, because when you read really difficult writers, they often use words that you have to look up, whereas the Arabs put them down at the bottom because they know that this is a vast language and not everybody has that vocabulary. In terms of the only woman mentioned in the Quran is Maryam. All of the other, there's no other woman mentioned by name in the Quran. You know, the Imra'atu Fir'aun, so Lut's wife, we don't know the names. We don't know Imra'atu Aziz, which is, some say it's Zuleikha, you know, in the tafsirs. The reason the Mufassirun give is that they say that for the Arab it was bad adab to mention a woman by name who was not your sahiba or your own. And because of Maryam's special maqam with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, she is Amatullah. And one of the very intriguing aspects of Rasam in Arabic is that and Rasam al-Uthmani is an incredible subject. But Isa is Isa ibn Maryam, and if you look, it doesn't drop the alif in the Rasam, so that it's actually Isa ibn Maryam. So Isa is it's really a badal, right? It's not a name. It's like Isa ibn Maryam, like Jesus, the son of Maryam, as like it's like he's not just Isa, he's the son of Maryam. And so she has that special maqam that she's the only one mentioned. In terms of the other words, I mean, Nisa is a generic plural, you know, and Arabic, I mean, there's a debate, is there insana, insanatun, fatanatun, you know, the Arabs talk about that. Insan is more like mensch in German, you know, it's the human being. And the Arabs tend to, Arabic, when there's no ambiguity, it uses the masculine form for the feminine. So for instance, a woman who's pregnant, she's the only one that can get pregnant. She's not called hamidatun, she's hamid. And which proves to you that Arabic is not a sexist language in that way, that it's only using you know, the masculine to include both, but when there's no ambiguity, it uses the masculine for the feminine, even though it's and sometimes it uses the feminine for the masculine, you know, like Shams or and on and on. So I think those nuances are very often brought out in some of the great commentators of the Quran. If you're interested in a really interesting modern rhetorical, I mean, a Kashaf is the great source for a lot of this, but a Samura'i who's an Iraqi scholar who wrote a Tafsir al-Bayani, is a really interesting, 4 volumes, but he really gets into the nuances of the different words in Arabic. Yeah.
Thank you, Sheikh. We are going to take a last question, and
Thank you very much.
yeah, Mervet, you are the luckiest to be the last to ask question to
So
our guest speaker.
are there, I'm seeing the names. Is this a multinational? Because there seems like Egyptian names.
Yes.
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 Yes. Mervet
Assalamu
is Egyptian.
alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh Hamza.
Marhaban.
Marhaban. My name is Hajja Mervet. In this context, I'm Hajja. And it's not a question. In fact, I'm very excited, and it's an honor really to be able to listen to you virtually. Thank you, Hammouda. Thank you, Sheikh. Jazakallahu khairan. In fact, I'll give you a very brief background. I'm born in Saudi Arabia. I used to أحفظ القرآن. I'm graduate of Al-Azhar University. أنا حفظت 20 جزءا وكنت I got excellent in Quran and fiqh. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. And regardless of that, my first job opportunity was in المجلس الأعلى للشؤون الإسلامية. It was the highest institute, and I was like, no way, I'm scared, I cannot, it's not me, guys. I'm running away of this civil service. And you know, in Egypt, when we have to have a to be civil servants as a kind of let's say security, huh? And I rejected that. I escaped it after almost 15 years. I was invited to interpret in a conference of حوار الأديان لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. It was terrifying experience, and I was like, no way, this is one of the most difficult fields I've ever can deal with. And that's why I decided, guys, you are heroes, أنتم أبطال, جزاكم الله خيرا, and I will never be able to do what you do. The more you talk, like I said, that I'm ignorant. Guys, I'm ignorant, alhamdulillah, that I'm just an interpreter. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Thank you so much.
الحمد لله رب العالمين. أحيانا الاعتراف بالجهل نعمة أيضا. بهذا perhaps I will be ending this talk in Arabic by way of summarizing in a couple of minutes what has been discussed in this very insightful and memorable discussion with the prominent scholar Shaykh. You are really, you've taken us into a journey, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf. أقول بدأنا النقاش والحديث وقد طرح شيخ الأساس أو الأصل، كيف أن الفكرة تسبق اللغة، وعلم آدم الأسماء كلها، وقال إن الإنسان هو حيوان ناطق، وهذا من النطق أي من الكلام. تميز الإنسان بكلامه أكثر من عقله، على عكس ما يرى إغريق الإنسان. ثم حملنا في رحلة أخرى تفسير آخر للبريفكس أو الترانس، هذه السابقة ترانس، يعني من العبور والمعبر ويعرب، ومن حتى العرب ربما اشتقوا من هذا العبور، ويعرب أي يفصح عن كلامه، وكيف يمكن للمفاهيم أن تنتقل. ثم فسر الآية الكريمة إن جعلناه قرآنا عربيا لعلكم تعقلون، وتحدث عن التواصل communication، وأن لغة العرب هي لغة التواصل، وتحدث عن تجربته في الترجمة مع الشيخ عبدالله بن بية، وضرب مثالا على ذلك عندما ذكر في الأمم المتحدة المذاهب المختلفة وكيف تاهت هذه العبارة واصطبغت بلغة العصر دون سياق أعطاه إياه ترجمة الأمم المتحدة. ثم تحدث عن الفرق الجوهري بين الجور والظلم، وكيف أن الجور هو بمعنى تيراني، أي جور من الحاكم، أما الظلم فيمكن أن يأتي به فعلا أي إنسان. ثم تحدث عن صفاء ونقاء اللغة العربية التي حافظت على نقائها، أي أن الكلمات المقترضة في اللغة العربية قليلة مقارنة بلغات أخرى مثل اللغة الإنجليزية، لغة خليط ومزيج، وكلما سافرت هذه اللغة إلا وأخذت واقترضت من الشعوب التي وصلت إليها واستوطنت فيها. تحدث عن أهمية الترجمة والمعرفة الكافية بالنحو والاشتقاق والمعجم، إن كان معجما في الكلام الإلقاء أو معجما في الفهم passive and active. وتحدث عن أهمية البلاغة rhetoric. تحدث عن أهمية الإحساس بالصور الشعرية والشعر. وكان هناك سؤال من الأستاذ محمد المنصوري عن أهمية الشعر وكيف أن الشعر يتطور هندسيا geometrically. وأخذ مثالا من اسم من أسماء المشاركين هدير، و غاص بنا عميقا في هذا الجذر وهذا المعنى النووي وتفرعاته المتعددة من هدر، هدار وغير ذلك. وأذكر أنه في السياق التونسي المحلي، خاصة في الجنوب التونسي، الجمل لما يكون هائجا يخرج تلك يعني ويكون غاضبا يخرج لسانه ليصبح كثا في الخارج، فهذا ما يسمى بالهدارة أيضا وهو من الهدير. تحدث أيضا عن الأوجه المختلفة لمصطلح الوجه، فالوجه صعب في ترجمته. وتحدث عن الشروح وأهمية الشروح glossaries، وبالإضافة إلى معاني حروف الجر وكيف أن لحروف الجر أيضا معان لا يمكن أن نغفل عنها مثل على وفي ومن. تحدث عن العهن والصوف والكيد والمكر. تحدث عن العقل والعقال وعن الحجر. تحدث عن أشياء أخرى كثيرة، كيف أنه يترجم سطر بسطر وفكرة بفكرة هي أقرب وأوفى للمعنى رآها وهو من تجربته مع الشيخ عبدالله بن بية. تحدث عن سوء الترجمة وخاصة في حروف مثل حرف الاستئناف وليس كمثله شيء، ضربه مثالا على ذلك. تحدث عن المترادفات وعن الاختلافات في الاشتقاق بين أنزلنا ونزلنا. وتحدث عن الفرق بين liberty and freedom في اللغة الإنجليزية وعن ضرورة الإحاطة علما بفقه اللغة. تحدث عن الفرق بين القوم والشعب والقبيلة، والقوم أنه ينسب إلى الآباء أساسا، وكيف أن القرآن ذكر القوم وذكر النساء بمعزل عن ذلك ليميز أن القوم يقصد به الرجال أكثر. وعن الفرق بين الوالد والأب والمائدة والخوان، الخوان دون طعام والمائدة فيها طعام. وعن معنى عسعسة والترجمة بالشرح، وعن معنى من رحم الإسلام وكيف توصل إلى ترجمته بالماتريكس وليس the womb، لأنه عاد إلى اللغة الأغريقية وهما سيان. وتحدث عن المترادفات والأضداد، خاتم وخاتم وحسب القراءات، كيف أن للصوت أيضا معنى ويدل على المعنى ولا غنى عنه. تحدث عن الخشية، وهذا ما أثارني، أن الخشية لا يمكن أن تكون إلا بعلم ومعرفة وحكمة. وضرب مثالا أنه لا يمكن في العربية أن نستخدم خشية لكلب مثلا لصاحبه. تحدث عن الكذب وهو أساسا غياب التحقق من الأمر. وتحدث عن الفرق بين الامرأة والصاحبة، وكيف أفرد القرآن لمريم مقاما عظيما بأن شرفها وذكرها هي الوحيدة بالاسم. أتمنى أنني حوصلت بإيجاز وأنا أترجم هنا، والترجمان خائن خوان، مثل ما يقول احنا في تونس أحيانا يقولون مقرونا كاذبة، يعني مكرونة بدون لحم أي بدون طعام دسم. فأتمنى أنني وأعتذر عن الخوان، والشيخ حمزة يوسف قد قدم لنا مائدة food for thought لأجيال. أشكرك سيدي الكريم على نبلك، على فكرك الغزير، وعلى وقتك الثمين الذي قضيته معنا، وأترك لك كلمة الختام. تفضل شيخنا الكريم.
الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. I just want to استدرك يعني when he asked me about Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah، وأنا حقيقة Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah هو من أفصح من ينطق بالضاد في هذا العصر. فلما قلت إنه just you know the thing I'm most proud of in terms of translation is the prayer of the oppressed, and this took me a really long time because I took a poem that was in the Rajas meter and I put it in a hexameter, which is very similar to the Rajas meter. So if you look at it, they're both metered. So if you say Ya man ila rahmatihi al-mafarru wa man ilayhi yalja'u al-mutarru, O you whose mercy is a refuge for all those in dire need who flee to you to lose their woes. ويا قريب العفو يا مولاه ويا مغيث كل من دعاه. O master of reprieve whose pardon is so near, you answer all in need, they know that you do hear. بك استغثنا يا مغيث الضعفاء فحسبنا يا ربي أنت وكفى. We beg for your relief, Redeemer of the weak. You are enough for us, both humbled and so meek. So that's what I'm most proud of in my translation work.
شكرا جزيلا شيخنا الجليل. وخير ما نختم به شعر، كلام بالشعر والدعاء المترجم والاستدراك من شيم الكبار. شكرا لكم جميعا سيداتي سادتي على حضوركم وعلى وقتكم وعلى مشاركتكم الفاعلة. وموعدنا، عندنا موعد آخر بعد غد إن شاء الله مع محاضرة أخرى، أو هي بعد غد يوم 7 من يونيو أو جوان 2020. العالمة الكبيرة الجليلة أيضا جونيال هاوس ستحدثنا عن ترجمة Translation as Intercultural Communication. أشكركم وتصبحون على ألف خير. إلى اللقاء.